Hi, so today we're going to talk about chemical pathways and how your body can break down the glucose and actually convert it into energy that your body can use. This is a process called cellular respiration. So food serves as a source of raw materials for the cells in the body and as a source of energy. So animals have to eat their food. Remember, plants can get their energy from the sun. They actually make their own food. So if we look inside animal cells and inside plant cells, we have an organelle called the mitochondrion. That is the place where the energy conversion occurs. So both plant and animal cells carry out the final stages of cellular respiration in the mitochondria. So here's the mitochondrion, that's the singular version. And if we open up the mitochondrion, there's different parts. There's membranes, outer and inner membranes, and then the inner membrane space, and the matrix, which is basically the cytoplasm of the mitochondria. So 1 gram of the sugar glucose, C6H12O6, when burned in the presence of oxygen, releases 3,811 calories of heat energy. So just as a review from earlier on in the year, a calorie is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So remember, heat is a form of energy. So cells don't actually burn glucose. You know, when you're working out, you say you're burning calories. You're not actually burning glucose. Instead, they gradually release the energy from glucose and other food compounds. This process begins with a pathway called glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis releases a small amount of energy from the glucose molecule. So here's a little overview of cellular respiration. So if oxygen is present, glycolysis is followed by the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So there's actually 3 chemical pathways when breaking down glucose: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. And the point of all of them is to make energy that your body can actually use. So glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain make up a process called cellular respiration. So here's where everything happens. Glucose, we start with glucose. Remember, we break down those carbohydrates that you ate into simpler monosaccharides called glucose. Okay? Glucose enters glycolysis, and this is happening outside of the mitochondria. Okay? It happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay. So glycolysis produces some ATP, which is the energy molecule your body can use. It also makes electrons, it carried in NADH, and something called pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid goes to the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle produces a little more ATP. Okay? The electrons produced by glycolysis and carried in NADH go to the electron transport chain. Okay? Krebs cycle also produces NADH and FADH2, which is another electron carrier. They go into the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain makes even more ATP. So all 3 of these make energy. You're going to see the electron transport chain actually makes the most energy. So cellular respiration is a process that releases energy by breaking down glucose and other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. That is key. Oxygen is needed for cellular respiration to occur. So the equation for cellular respiration is 6 oxygen molecules plus a molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, makes 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water plus energy. So each of the 3 stages of cellular respiration captures some of the chemical energy available in food molecules and uses it to produce ATP. So glycolysis, like I said earlier, takes place in the cytoplasm. Krebs cycle and electron transport chain take place in the mitochondria. So let's start with glycolysis. Glycolysis is a process in which 1 molecule of glucose is broken down in half, producing 2 molecules of pyruvic acid and a 3-carbon compound. At the beginning of glycolysis, the cell uses up 2 molecules of ATP to start the reaction. So in order to get this reaction started, we actually do need to add a little bit of energy. So we end up with glucose, which has 6 carbon molecules. We need 2 molecules of ATP, and it splits it into 2 3-carbon molecules. we end up with 2 pyruvic acids. So when glycolysis is complete, actually 4 ATP molecules have been produced. So from this step to making the pyruvic acid, we make 4 molecules of ATP. However, since we used 2 in the beginning, we only have a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. So glycolysis only produces 2 ATP molecules. That's not a lot of ATP. So what also happens is NADH production. One reaction of glycolysis removes 4 high-energy electrons, passing them to the electron carrier called NAD+, and it turns it into NADH. So each NAD+ accepts a pair of high-energy electrons and becomes an NADH molecule. So we've made 4 ATP molecules, which is really only a net gain of 2, and we've also made 2 NADH molecules, all from 1 molecule of glucose. The NADH molecule holds the electrons until they can be transferred to other molecules. You'll see they're going to be transferred to the electron transport chain, right here. So the advantage of glycolysis, you guys use glycolysis all the time. So the process of glycolysis is so fast that cells can produce thousands of ATP molecules in a few milliseconds. And it doesn't require oxygen to happen. So you've heard of aerobic and anaerobic exercise. Okay, so if you're doing weight training or you're holding a plank, that's anaerobic. That means basically your muscles are just performing glycolysis. They're not using oxygen. They're just going through glycolysis because it's fast. So if you need to like push a car off of someone, you actually have the ability to do that, and you would use glycolysis because it's a really quick way to get a really big burst of energy, but it doesn't last. You can't sustain that energy over a long time. In order to sustain energy, you need oxygen to do that. So fermentation is another process you can get energy from. So when oxygen is not present, glycolysis is followed by a different pathway. The combined process of this pathway and glycolysis is called fermentation. Fermentation releases energy from food molecules by producing ATP in the absence of oxygen. So during fermentation, cells convert NADH to NAD+ by passing high energy electrons back to pyruvic acid. This action converts NADH back to NAD+ and allows glycolysis to continue producing a steady supply of ATP. So fermentation does not require oxygen, so it's called an anaerobic process. There's 2 main types of fermentation, lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. You may be familiar with lactic acid fermentation. When you're lifting weights, afterwards, if you feel like your biceps, they may feel a little firm, like there's fluid in there, that's because of lactic acid building up in your muscles. Because you were doing anaerobic exercise, lactic acid is building up from the fermentation process. So let's start with alcoholic fermentation. Yeast and a few other microorganisms use alcoholic fermentation, forming ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide as waste. The equation for alcoholic fermentation after glycolysis is pyruvic acid plus NADH makes alcohol, carbon dioxide, and more NAD+. Okay? Lactic acid fermentation, on the other hand, many cells' pyruvic acid that accumulates as a result of glycolysis can be converted to lactic acid. This is called lactic acid fermentation, and it regenerates NAD+ so that glycolysis can continue. It converts glucose into lactic acid. So the first part of the equation is glycolysis. Okay, we're going to split glucose into 2 pyruvic acid molecules, producing 2 ATP and 2 NADH. That pyruvic acid is then converted into lactic acid, regenerating NAD+, so it can go back to the beginning and we can continue making ATP from glucose without oxygen. The NADH molecule holds the electrons until they can be transferred to other molecules. By doing this, NAD+ helps to pass energy from glucose to other pathways in the cell. The equation for lactic acid fermentation after glycolysis is pyruvic acid plus NADH makes lactic acid and NAD+. And that is all for today. Thanks for watching.